In 1917, a 34-year-old German philosopher and lawyer named Adolf Reinach died in the trenches of Flanders, and with him died insights that wouldn't be rediscovered for another 50 years. Now, you might think that that's kind of a dramatic claim, that people make about philosophers all the time. Something like, this obscure thinker changed everything. But in this case, we have documentary evidence that this was true. We lost a real genius that not many people know about himself, but they will know him by his works and the impact he had on 20th century and also 21st century philosophy. So, and we have testimony of people who were there. So just to give you a brief, to emphasize the importance of this man that we'll be talking about today, here are a couple of the testimonies that we have. Now, there's a man named Herbert Spiegelberg, I believe that's how you pronounce it, and he was an American philosopher who played a prominent role in the advancement of the phenomenological movement, which started in Germany in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so Spiegelberg was a very big proponent of it in the U.S., and he tells us something remarkable. He says, independently of each other, the Göttingen students of phenomenology like Wilhelm Schaap, Dietrich von Hildebrandt, Alexander Corre, and Edith Stein, in their accounts of this period, they refer to Reinach and not to Husserl as their real teacher in phenomenology. And if you've watched my video on Husserl or just know a bit of background on these matters, you'll know how important Husserl was for the phenomenological movement and founding the methodology that backs that up. And we also have Hedwig Conrad Martius, who was a German phenomenologist and later became a famous Christian mystic. And he goes even further, calling Reinach the phenomenologist par excellence. So think about that for a second, right? So we have Edmund Husserl, who was ostensibly the founder of phenomenology. He was a towering figure in 20th century philosophy. Yet many of his own students, a big group of them, chose this other man, Reinach, as their teacher. They said that that's who they found the real insights into phenomenology with. And so we have a bit of a mystery here, right? Because, who was this Adolf Reinach? What did he discover that made brilliant students choose him over the founder of the movement? And here's where it gets really tragic. Spiegelberg tells us that it was Reinach's death in action in World War I in 1917, rather than Husserl's going to Freiburg, which cut short not only his own promise, but that of the Göttingen phenomenological circle. So one death, one brilliant mind that was silenced at the age of 34. And according to many brilliant people who were there, we have their real testimony, that this single tragedy, this death, altered the entire trajectory of one of the most important philosophical movements of the modern era. And I would argue that the phenomenological movement was one of the greatest heights in philosophy to be reached, up there with the golden age of Athens. And, we have Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Academy, these sorts of advancements. In terms of pushing philosophy forward, the phenomenological movement in the late 19th, early 20th century stands in that realm of importance as those three great philosophers in ancient Greece. So that's one reason why it's important. Another reason you may ask is, why should we care about some German philosopher who died over a century ago? And so I'll give you mainly three more contemporary reasons why that he matters not just to the history of philosophy, but to today, right now, in our modern moment. And so, first, every single time you make a promise, whether it's I'll meet you for coffee at 3:00 today, or I promise to love and cherish you forever, or any sort of obligation legally, I promise to pay back this money that you loaned me. You are engaging with philosophical problems that Reinach helped to solve. How can words create obligations? What makes a promise binding? Why should anyone believe that saying I promise actually changes anything about the real world? These aren't just abstract questions. They are the foundation of contracts, of relationships, of our entire legal system, basically. And Reinach was trying to figure this out, and he largely, his answers are incredibly important to us today. And he was doing this in 1913. And secondly, his ideas that we think of as cutting-edge contemporary philosophy that made philosophers famous up until really, the 1990s, early 2000s, it was still radical, groundbreaking territory. Reinach was figuring all this out decades before, 50, 60, 70 years before they were, quote-unquote, invented by others. For example, we have speech act theory, which we'll get into a bit more, where Austin famously says in his, he writes a very famous paper, very influential, How to Do Things with Words, and that appeared in 1962, so again, 50 years after Reinach. And Reinach developed a sophisticated theory of speech acts before Austin in the 60s. And we also have Searle's groundbreaking work on social ontology with his Construction of Social Reality, which was published in 1995. And Reinach laid the foundations for understanding social institutions and their ontological status 8 decades earlier. And so many times we have this 20th century philosophy sort of discovering insights that Reinach had already articulated with stunning clarity at the beginning of the century. And third, Reinach developed a way of doing philosophy that might just solve some of the problems that still plague us today. You know how philosophy sometimes feel like it gets lost in abstraction, it gets disconnected from ordinary experience. Or maybe how sometimes, philosophers, they feel like reading them, you feel like they're imposing complicated theories on relatively simple phenomena for no particular reason. It's not advancing anything. Well, Reinach found a way to be rigorously systematic while staying true to the way things actually present themselves in experience. And he called this, realist phenomenology. And it represents a road largely not taken in 20th century and even 21st century thought. It's coming back a little bit more now, and I'm hoping, videos like this will help to encourage people to study and get into their works, because it's largely relegated just to academic philosophers. So moving on, what makes the story particularly poignant is that we're not just talking about abstract intellectual history. We're talking about a real human cost, because when Reinach died in 1917, he left behind not just unfinished work, but unfinished insights that might have transformed how we think about the mind, our society, and human reality in general. Even his wife, Pauline, wrote, he was just beginning to see his path clearly when the war took him from us. And so if you think about it this way, it would be like, and I don't think this is hyperbole to say, it would, what if Einstein had died at 34 before developing his theory of relativity? Or what if Darwin had died before writing on the origin of species? Or had only sketched outlines of what that was later to become. We'd be living in a fundamentally different intellectual and scientific and technological world. Our society would be completely different. Would we have gone to the moon without Einstein's insights or scientific progress into biology if we didn't have Darwin's insights? And so, according to many people who knew him, Reinach's philosophical genius was on that caliber. So the question that we're going to explore in this video today isn't just, who was Adolf Reinach? It's what did we lose, and perhaps more importantly, what can we still recover by studying his work and his thought today. Because the remarkable thing is that many of Reinach's insights are just as relevant today as they were a century ago. And in a lot of ways, they're maybe more so, because we live in an age where we're constantly making digital promises, creating online obligations, participating in virtual communities, and so understanding the ontological foundations of social reality has never been more crucial. And to understand what we lost and in what way we might still recover from that loss, we need to understand what Reinach discovered and why his approach to philosophy was so revolutionary that it threatened to overshadow Husserl himself. And we need to understand why those students saw in Reinach not just another philosopher, but a phenomenologist par excellence, the one who showed them how to see reality clearly without this distorting lens of theoretical prejudice, basically. And so we need to understand why, when Adolf Reinach died in those trenches in Flanders, what philosophy lost, and not just in a brilliant individual, which he was, but an entire way of approaching the deepest questions about human existence and social reality. So, to understand what we lost, we need to give some context to this. We need to understand what Reinach discovered and why his approach to philosophy was so revolutionary that it threatened to overshadow Husserl, before we can get into really the nitty-gritty of what he thought. So, think about in the early 20th century German philosophy, it was basically an intellectual gold rush, if you will. Everyone was racing to stake claims on this new territory called Phenomenology. And like any gold rush, you had prospectors with very different ideas about how to mine the ore that they'd discovered. And so the territory had been opened up by Edmund Husserl, like I said, and mainly through his book, Logical Investigations, which was published between 1900 and 1901. And Husserl made a revolutionary discovery. Instead of asking abstract questions about knowledge or reality, we should look directly at how things present themselves to human consciousness. We should study phenomena, literally, that which shows itself to us. So it was a breakthrough that promised to put philosophy on a new foundation. But here's where things get interesting, because by 1905, when the young Adolf Reinach arrived in Göttingen to work with Husserl, the master had begun developing what he called transcendental phenomenology. And this is where, according to a lot of people, the problem started. Because, you see, Husserl had become increasingly convinced that to study phenomena properly, you had to perform what he called the phenomenological reduction. You had to systematically bracket or suspend your belief in the external world. Don't ask whether that table really exists. Just study how it appears to your consciousness. Don't worry about whether, other people have minds. Just examine the way others are given to you in your own experience of them. Now, this might sound reasonable in principle, but think about what that means in practice and working that out in a systematic methodology. You're trying to understand human experience by systematically ignoring most of it, or a large part of it, or you're trying to, figure out one part of it without bridging the gap into the external world, basically. And to be fair, the empiricists have the same problem with if they just focus on the external world while bracketing the internal world. There's that challenge of how you bridge that gap. And so, you're trying to understand human experience by systematically ignoring one part or the other. You want to study how promises work in society, but you have to bracket the question of whether people actually exist or society actually exists to receive your promises. You want to understand social reality externally and also internally, but you have to assume one of those, the external part. You bracket that, but you need that in your analysis, basically. And Husserl thought that this bracketing was the only way to achieve the kind of rigorous scientific approach that philosophy needed, at least insofar as it applied to the internal world, the Lebenswelt, the if you will, the life world. But many of his students found themselves in an impossible position. They'd come to phenomenology because it promised to take experience seriously, our own internal world seriously, and now they were being asked to ignore most of the basic features of experience in order to study it properly. It's a bit like being told, if you want to understand how swimming works, the first thing you have to do is get out of the water. Well, yes, you might learn something about the theory of swimming, but you're not going to understand what's actually like to swim. And this created what we called, a methodological crisis in the early beginnings of phenomenology. The students gathered around Husserl and Göttingen, brilliant people, like I've mentioned, Schaap and Hildebrandt and Stein, and they wanted to follow phenomenology's promise to study things as they actually present themselves. But they were being told to do this properly, they first had to perform elaborate methodological maneuvers that seemed to distance themselves or obscure or even, misconstrue the very phenomena that they'd wanted to understand. And this is where Adolf Reinach enters the picture, because he had a radically different idea. And so, before we get there, just a quick little biographical sketch, because it will inform our analysis of his thought and his work. So Reinach was born in 1883 to a prominent Jewish family in Mainz, which is a city in Western Germany. And Reinach had originally trained not as a philosopher, but as a lawyer. He'd written his dissertation on causality in criminal law, a topic that required him to think very carefully about how actions relate to their consequences, how intentions relate to obligations, and how legal concepts connect to social reality. And so this wasn't an abstract philosophical theorizing. This was thinking about concepts that have to work in the real world. And so when Reinach entered phenomenology, he saw something that his fellow students might have missed. What if the problem wasn't with experience, but with the method? What if instead of performing reductions and bracketing procedures, we just paid careful attention to how things actually present themselves? And we wouldn't have to bracket the external world. And so this kind of became the core of what Reinach called realist phenomenology. Instead of methodological manipulation, we give phenomena direct attention. Instead of bracketing the external world, let's engage with it directly. Instead of constructing phenomena through complex procedures, let phenomena show themselves. And so in 1914, Reinach gave a lecture in Marburg that was essentially a manifesto of his new approach. And he called this lecture Concerning Phenomenology, and it's probably one of the clearest statements of an alternative vision for the phenomenological movement that we have. In this lecture, he argued that phenomena don't need to be constructed through methodological procedures. They're already there, waiting to be seen by anyone willing to look carefully enough. The key insight here was this: experience itself has structure. Not structure imposed by our cognitive apparatus, as Immanuel Kant had argued. Not structure created through methodological reduction, as Husserl was claiming, but real structure, built into the very nature of the things we encounter. And so there's this bit of both external and internal when we're trying to study these things. And so when you make a promise, you don't just have a psychological experience. You create a real obligation in the external world. When you give a command, you don't just express a desire. You generate genuine authority. And when you make a request, you don't just communicate information. What you do is you establish a legitimate claim on someone else's attention. So these aren't just feelings or mental phenomena. They become objective features of social reality. And they don't require elaborate philosophical theory to discover. They just require careful attention to what's actually happening when we engage with each other. And so this was kind of philosophical dynamite, if you will, because, if Reinach was right, which I think he was, then most of the methodological apparatus that Husserl was developing and constructing was just not unnecessary, but it was actually counterproductive. It was getting in the way of seeing what was right there to be seen in a direct realist approach. And so, you can imagine how that went over with Husserl. Here was his student arguing that the careful methodological work that he'd been doing, he wrote voluminously, thousands and tens of thousands of pages. And it was about what he thought was essential to phenomenology. He was the founder of this movement. And here was his student saying, actually, you're kind of preventing phenomenology from achieving its goals. It would be like, a star pupil telling Einstein that relativity theory was making physics more complicated than it needed to be. And, maybe that's not the best analogy, but the point is, here's the remarkable thing. Other students of Husserl were convinced, not necessarily by Reinach's arguments, but they were convinced primarily by his results. When Reinach analyzed promising or commanding or the nature of legal obligations, he wasn't just spinning theoretical webs. He was uncovering structures that everybody could recognize once they were pointed out. And it's like the difference between somebody who tells you complicated theories about why jokes are funny and somebody who actually makes you laugh. You understand? So Reinach wasn't just talking about the phenomena. He was showing people how to see them, what was already there. He was giving them the tools to see them. And that's what Husserl wasn't delivering. And so then what happens? Well, in 1914, the war breaks out. And like many of his generation, Reinach enlists. The man who had been developing what might have been a revolutionary alternative to Husserlian phenomenology found himself in the trenches of the Western Front. And we have some of his letters from that period, and if you read them, they're heartbreaking. Because here's someone who had been making breakthrough discoveries, who was, in all intents and purposes, a philosophical genius. He was getting to the core, the core nature of social reality. And he was forced to confront social reality in its most destructive form. He writes to his wife about philosophical insights that come to him even in the midst of warfare, in the trenches. And then he also says in the same breath, about the impossibility of developing these ideas under such circumstances. The chaos, it just wasn't possible. And in 1917, shortly after he had been baptized into the evangelical church, a decision that reflected his deepening engagement with questions about ultimate reality, Adolf Reinach was killed in action in Flanders. He was only 34 years old. But here's what makes this tragedy even more profound. We know from the testimony of many of his students that Reinach was just hitting his stride. He was just coming into his full intellectual powers. He had, he was working on developing this basic framework for realist phenomenology. And he kind of was starting to lay the foundations. He was beginning to apply it systematically to a full range of philosophical problems. Many of what convinced the students early on was how he applied it to civil law. But he had plans to apply it to many other phenomena. But he did write his what we have is his masterwork, because he wasn't able to write anything else. And it's called the A Priori Foundations of the Civil Law, which was published in 1913. And it was supposed to be just the first volume of a comprehensive investigation into the ontological foundations of social reality. What might we have achieved with another 30 years if he had lived past the Great War? What other domains might he have illuminated with his distinctive combination of phenomenological sensitivity and systematic rigor? We'll never know. I mean, we have an idea because some of the students in those circles, like for example, Edith Stein, applied many of the same techniques and the same realist phenomenological insight into, for example, the state. And I plan to do, if I haven't already, done a video on her because it's a lot of overlap. It's very, very interesting. But the question isn't just where was Reinach going or what he discovered. It's more about how he discovered it. How did he see what others were missing? How was his approach to philosophy different from Husserl's transcendental turn, or the empiricists, or the pragmatists? Why were Reinach's insights so compelling that they made students choose him over the founder of the phenomenological movement? And so to answer these questions, we need to look at Reinach's actual philosophical innovations. We need to understand the theoretical framework that allowed him to see social phenomena with such unprecedented clarity. And we need to see why his approach represents not just an alternative to Husserlian phenomenology, but potentially a superior alternative, one that might have led 20th century philosophy in very different directions. And so the question is, what exactly did Reinach see that others were missing? What was the core insights that made his approach so powerful? And here it is in Reinach's own words. We can surely take it as generally granted that there are no self-evident and necessary relations of essence in the causal relations of external events. However, it is, to speak with Hume, that we come to know that fire produces smoke. This is surely not intelligibly grounded in the essence of fire, as it lies in the essence of the number 3 to be larger than the number 2. Now, that might sound a bit like some abstract philosophical jargon, but Reinach is actually making a revolutionary point here about the structure of reality itself. He's saying that the world contains two fundamentally different kinds of facts. So think about it this way. Some things we know are true because we've observed them. Fire produces smoke. Well, how do you know that? You've seen it happen over and over again. It's what Hume called irregularity. We notice that one thing tends to follow another, and we call that a causal connection. But there's no logical necessity there. You could imagine a world where fire doesn't produce smoke. But other things are different. 3 is larger than 2. How do you know that? Well, did you discover it or observe it? Or did you observe lots of cases where 3 is larger than 2? Did you have to wait for empirical confirmation? No, of course not. You know it because you understand what 3 and 2 are. You understand their essence. And this relation is grounded in their very essence, their nature as the numbers as they are, right? And so here's Reinach's breakthrough insight. Social phenomena work like mathematics, not physics. When you make a promise, you don't just happen to create an obligation. You necessarily create an obligation. It's grounded in the very essence of what promising is. And this is very philosophically important because it meant that there was a whole domain of reality that philosophers had been largely ignoring. We'd been so focused on the contrast between empirical facts and logical truths that we'd miss something right in the middle, a priori facts about concrete reality. And Reinach discovered that reality has a logical structure built into it, not imposed by our minds, but actually there in the world. Some states of affairs obtain not because we happen to observe them, and not because they're merely logical constructions, but because they're grounded in the essential nature of the entities involved. And so let me give you some examples to make this more concrete. Orange lies between, the color orange lies between the colors red and yellow on the color spectrum, right? Is that an empirical discovery? Well, partly it is, right? But once you really understand what what the colors orange and red and yellow really are, essentially, what they essentially are, you can see that this relationship is necessary. It couldn't be otherwise in any realm, in any metaphysical realm. Or take this another example. So remorse presupposes the memory of a past wrongdoing. Is that just a psychological observation? Not really. It's built in the very concept of remorse. You can't feel genuine remorse about something you don't remember doing wrong. It's a necessary connection grounded in essences. Or here's one that, will become crucial for understanding social reality a bit later on. Promises generate obligation in virtue of their essence. This isn't just a useful social convention. It's not a psychological fact about how people tend to feel after making a promise. No. It's a necessary connection built into the very nature of promising itself. And here's Reinach's beautifully simple answer. We know them the same way we know mathematical truths, through direct insight, through intuition of essences. And here's the remarkable thing. You don't need special training to have these insights. You don't need to perform methodological reductions or bracketing of the natural world. No, Reinach says that, I can now, in this moment, convince myself with complete certainty of the fact that orange lies qualitatively between red and yellow, if only I succeed in bringing to clear intuition for myself the corresponding natures. You just need to pay attention directly to the real world and the social reality around you. So if you've ever made a promise, you can understand that promises are essentially directed towards someone or to someone, right? There can't be a promise that isn't made to some promisee, even if that promisee is yourself. I promise to make my bed tomorrow morning. It's a promise directed at me. Or, I promise to go to the grocery store tomorrow to pick you up mangoes or something like that because, your girlfriend or boyfriend or wife or husband has asked you to do that. You're promising. And you could study hundreds of cases of promising, but you don't need to. You can just simply look at one of those examples and say, this is true. And the more you look at them, then you say the more you can say that this is the essential component of a promise. And so think about what this means for philosophical method. Instead of elaborate theoretical constructions, we can have direct access to the essential structures of reality. Instead of bracketing experience of the real world, we can trust it. We can instead of reducing social phenomena to something else, like psychology or biology or economics, material conditions, no, we can study these social phenomena as they actually are, as we directly experience them in the real world. And so this is what is meant by realist phenomenology that Reinach was developing. The phenomena we're studying themselves have structure. Our job isn't to impose structure on them or to construct these structures through methodological procedures. No, our job in actuality is to see the structure that's already there and to accurately, veridically describe them as such. And so it was a very profound insight. But to understand how this all works, now we need to get clear about Reinach's ontological framework, because this will be very important for you might be a bit skeptical, but this is where things get more systematically interesting, because Reinach discovers that reality has a very specific architecture. And so here's how we're going to think about it. So think of reality as having two basic kinds of furniture, objects and states of affairs. And this is it may sound a bit ontological. We're taking a two category, ontology, basically. So stick with me, because this fundamental distinction between objects and states of affairs is going to explain why logic works the way it does, why truth and falsehood are possible, and why social obligations can be, in fact, real. So objects are the things that exist. Your coffee cup, your computer, your thoughts about the coffee cup, or the number 7, the essence of being red. These are all objects that exist, whether purely intentionally or materially, right? And there are also states of affairs, and these are the facts about those objects. So the coffee cup being on the table, you're thinking about the coffee cup, the 7 being larger than 5, the rose being red. These are all states of affairs. And so let me explain this a bit more with a concrete example. So let's take the red rose, right? The rose itself is an object. It exists. It's a material object. And the being red of the rose is a state of affairs. And we can reason about whether this state of affairs obtains or not. Is it true that the rose is red? If the rose weren't red but white, the rose would still exist, right? But different states of affairs would obtain than the being red of the rose. It would actually the being white of the rose. And so you can kind of see what's happening here, right? Objects can exist even when facts about them don't obtain. But states of affairs have a different kind of structure entirely. They're essentially predicative, right? They have the form of the being f of x, if you want to get a bit technical. And this is, Aristotle talks a lot about predicates and predication, and actually that's a very good idea for a video as well, so I will remind myself of that. But getting back to Reinach, so because of this predicative structure, they can either be positive or negative. The being red of the rose is a positive state of affairs. The not being white of the rose is a negative state of affairs. And here's the crucial point. Both of them can obtain at the same time, right? The rose can be red, which is a positive state of affairs obtaining, and not be white, the negative state of obtaining, at the same time. And now you might think this is some philosophical hair splitting or something like that, but actually, it explains something fundamental about logic and truth. Because the principle of non-contradiction, that something can't be both F and not F at the same time, isn't just an arbitrary rule of thought. It's grounded in the ontological structure of states of affairs. So either a positive state of affairs obtains or its negative contradictory does, but not both. And so this isn't something we impose on reality through our logical thinking. It's something we discover about the structure of reality itself. And so things get more interesting for when we talk about how this helps us understand social phenomena. And because states of affairs can instantiate what Reinach calls modal properties. Some states of affairs are necessary. They obtain in virtue of the essences involved. And others are merely possible or contingent. 1 second. So, but states of affairs can also instantiate what Reinach calls deontic properties. So we have the modal properties, and now the deontic properties. So some states of affairs are obligatory. Others are permissible or forbidden. Ooh, excuse me. They attack. They don't want me to tell you this information. They attack my throat. Anyway. So, where was I? So some states of affairs have modal properties, but they can also instantiate deontic properties. And so that means that some states of affairs are obligatory, others are permissible or forbidden. And this isn't just a matter of our attitudes towards them. It's built in into the objective structure of reality. So when you make a promise to meet me for lunch, let's say, you don't just create a psychological expectation, you create a state of affairs with genuine deontic properties. Your meeting me for lunch becomes obligatory. Not just obligatory relative to social conventions, as many people think, or obligatory given your psychological makeup, to take promises seriously. No, it's objectively obligatory. And this may sound a bit strange. It may ring a bit weird in the ear, right? How can obligations be objective features of reality? But think about it this way. You already accept that mathematical relationships are objective, right? You don't think that 3 is larger than 2 is just a matter of, opinion or social convention. I hope you don't, at least. I mean, that would make logic and math and many things very difficult. Well, Reinach is suggesting that when you understand the essential nature of promising, you'll see that promissory obligations are just as objective as mathematical relationships. And the method for discovering those deontic properties is the same as the method for discovering mathematical properties. Careful attention to the essential structures involved. That's what's key. That's the crucial point. And so when you really understand what promising is, not just the word promise or the social institution of contracts, right? But the act of promising itself, you can see that it necessarily generates obligations. And this gives us a completely new way of understanding social reality, because social institutions aren't just arbitrary human constructions made out of convention that we can change at will. No, they're not just evolutionary adaptations or useful fictions. They're grounded in objective essential structures that we can discover through careful phenomenological investigation. And so this brings us to probably Reinach's most revolutionary discovery. We'll be kind of building this up now. And that revolutionary discovery is what's called the theory of social acts. And this is the insight that wouldn't be discovered for at least another 50 years and then developed systematically for the next 70 years. So it's still an ongoing project even now. And it's going to completely change how we think about language and society and human interaction in general. So this is the social acts revolution. Now the problem, the puzzle that Reinach was trying to solve, is one that probably seems obvious to us now, but was a real issue. It was a real puzzle for early 20th century philosophy. And the puzzle is this: how can mere words create obligations? How can speech acts change reality? So think about that. When you say, I promise to meet you at the cafe at 3, you're not just describing some inner psychological state. You're not just predicting your future behavior. You're doing something. You're creating a genuine obligation that didn't exist before you spoke. Or, saying, I promise to love you, whether in sickness and in good health. You're making a promise to marry somebody. And yeah, you do have a piece of paper that signifies that promise, but at the core of what it means to get married, you're making a speech act promise. And that creates a genuine obligation to both of you to do what you stipulate in what it means to be married. And so how is this all possible? How can mere words have this kind of power? Now, Husserl tried to answer this question, but he argued that all speech acts are really just expressions of internal mental states. So when I say I promise, you're expressing your belief that you have the intention to do what you're promising. These words don't actually create obligations. They just communicate psychological information. But what Reinach saw is that this couldn't be right, because there's a crucial difference between promising and just reporting your intentions. When you promise to marry somebody, when you promise to meet somebody at the cafe at 3 tomorrow, something happens that doesn't happen when you merely report your psychological intentions. You create what Reinach calls the need of being heard. And so there's a crucial difference here. If you decide privately to meet someone for lunch, that's your business. Your private intention doesn't obligate you to anyone. If you just think about, maybe I'll go to the cafe. Just thinking, maybe I'll go to the cafe tomorrow and have lunch with my friend. But if you promise to meet somebody for lunch, if you say to your friend, I promise to meet you at the cafe tomorrow at 3, you've created a situation where that person has a legitimate claim on your behavior. And that claim exists only if they've heard your promise or read your promise even. It could be, now that we have email and text messaging and these sorts of things, if you text it to somebody, the same situation applies. And so this is what Reinach calls the defining characteristic of social acts. The defining characteristic is that they require an audience to achieve their effects. A promise that no one hears isn't really a promise at all, if it's directed to somebody else. If you say to yourself, I promise to clean my room tomorrow. Okay, you've heard it. You've said it out loud. It's not just an intention that you think. You've made that promise, or you write it down and put it up on a mirror or something. So, and that works the same way with many different sort of social phenomena. A command that no one hears doesn't create any authority. A request that no one hears doesn't establish any legitimate claim. And that's the crucial point. It's not enough that just for an audience just to hear the sounds you make or read the words or something like this. They have to understand that you're performing a social act. If you say, I promise in a language that they don't understand, you haven't successfully promised. If you're obviously joking or being sarcastic, kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod sort of thing, you haven't actually created a real obligation. And this is what Reinach means when he says that social acts have essential conditions for success. For a promise to be genuine, several things need to be in place. You have to have the genuine intention to do what you're promising. You have to address your promise to someone capable of understanding it. And that someone has to actually receive and understand your promise. Like again, if you make a promise to somebody in Swahili and they don't understand Swahili, there's no obligation that's been created. So if any of these conditions fails, you don't have a real promise. You have what Reinach calls a pseudo-performance. It looks like promising, but it doesn't actually create the obligations that genuine promising creates. So if you're an actor in a play, and you say the words, and the person who you're saying them to on stage understands them, but you don't have the genuine intention to make a promise because you're the character. You're not yourself. There's no promise made. So you can see kind of how this works and how, it might seem like common sense, but it's actually very philosophically revolutionary. Because Reinach was showing that social acts have objective conditions of success. There are right and wrong ways to perform them, and we can reason about those right and wrong ways to do that. And when they're performed correctly, they create objective obligations in the real world. And again, I say it's revolutionary, and I'm not being hyperbolic here. And oftentimes we look back at insights made by even ancient Greek philosophers and things like this, and be like, oh, if I was back then, of course I would have That's an easy one, basically. And it kind of seemed, at first blush, it may seem like that here, but that's not the case, because it took a lot of work and a lot of direct, very important thinking to get here, to make it bare for us to understand. And more importantly, it changed the way how we understand social reality, because every time you make a promise or give a command or make a request or offer an apology, you're not just expressing your psychological state or following a social convention. You're participating in objective structures of social reality. You're creating and responding to genuine normative facts. And here's where Reinach's insight becomes really profound. He realized that these social acts create what he calls social normativity, obligations and claims that arise purely from the performance of the acts themselves. When you make a promise to do something, you also thereby create an obligation to do it. When someone makes a request of you, they create a claim on your attention. When you give a command, you create genuine authority. But there's a crucial distinction here to be made. Social normativity is different from moral normativity. The fact that you've promised to do something doesn't automatically make it morally right to do it. Social obligations can conflict with moral duties. So suppose you promise to help your friend cheat on an exam, let's say. You've created a genuine social obligation. The promise really does bind you to your friend. But you also have a moral duty not to participate in academic dishonesty. So you have a conflict here between social and moral normativity. So, how do you resolve such conflicts? Well, Reinach has an answer here, and the answer is that moral normativity is grounded in values and their hierarchical ordering. Remember Searle here. Some values are objectively higher than others. Higher values generate stronger duties. So if your moral duty not to cheat is based on a higher value than your social obligation to keep your promise, then you ought to break your promise. But, and this is what makes Reinach's analysis so sophisticated, even when you break your promise for moral reasons, the social obligation doesn't just disappear. You've still wronged your friend in one sense, right? Even though you've done the right thing, the morally right thing, let's say, and not helped him participate in academic dishonesty and cheating, you owe him or her an explanation. Maybe even an apology for putting them in that position that you break your promise. And so this gives us a much more nuanced understanding of moral life than we get from theories that just try to reduce everything to a single kind of normativity, right? Real human life involves multiple, sometimes conflicting sources of obligation. And part of moral maturity is learning to navigate these conflicts thoughtfully. And now this is where the analysis is so ahead of its time, because it gives us that maturity. He developed this in 1913. These three crucial insights, I would say. And they were the foundation for speech act theory. Now, speech act theory didn't emerge in analytic philosophy until J.L. Austin he gave some lectures in the 1950s and also wrote influential papers and books. And John Searle came along with institutional facts, and he started developing those in the 1960s and 70s and really reached its peak with the construction of social reality, his book in 1995. And so contemporary work on the moral psychology of promising is still catching up to the insights that Reinach articulated a century ago. And unlike later theorists, Reinach grounded his analysis in a systematic ontology. He didn't just describe how speech acts work. He tried to explain why they work. He wanted to show how social acts create genuine ontological facts. not just useful social conventions, but to tie them to nature, to the structure, the architecture of reality itself. And that's what makes his approach so powerful. Because instead of trying to explain social phenomena in terms of something else, like psychology, biology, evolutionary adaptation, what have you, he studied them as they appear to us and as they are in their own right, these phenomena. He took social reality seriously as a genuine domain of investigation. And the method that made this possible was realist phenomenology. It was a combination of taking the external world seriously and the internal world seriously, and the phenomena of the external world as they present themselves to us internally, right? So by paying a careful attention to social acts as they actually present themselves in experience, by trusting the essential structures revealed in that experience, he was able to see connections and distinctions that purely theoretical approaches had missed, or bracketing approaches had bracketed, had left out. They passed the buck on them. And the tragedy is that this approach largely died with Reinach in 1917. I mean, there are others, and we'll get into some other videos that carried on this mission, and that they're kind of reviving it still today in various universities in the U.S. and also in Europe. But it's not a very large group. It never really has been. But I think it's probably the most important and philosophically revolutionary insights since probably ancient Greece. And that's why I'm trying to use this video to get the word out, to make a sort of an introduction to these sorts of insights, because, we've started recovering these as well. People are starting to really focus on them again, but the word still needs to get out. We need more and more people working on them, because the situation that we find ourselves in, technological advancements, we'll need to have a clear picture of the phenomena that we're talking about, that is relevant to us, not distorted by some ideological or authoritarian sort of dogma, right? And so we're starting to recover these insights, but we can ask now, because the questions come up, what do they mean? What do these insights from Reinach mean for how we understand ourselves in our current social world, the digital world? What can Reinach's realist phenomenology still teach us today, in the age of hyper advanced technologies that are continuing to advance even more quickly as time goes on? How might his approach help us to navigate the social and moral complexities of contemporary life? Well, and so I kind of teased this before, but here's one of the most remarkable stories in philosophy, right? So we have, throughout the 20th century, philosophers rediscovering Reinach's insights, a few at a time, or carrying them on after he died. And so a core group carried them on after he died in World War I. And then they were kind of rediscovered by other people who may or may not have known about his work. And so it's like independent, inventions of the wheel or calculus or something like that, each hailed as a breakthrough. And so I just kind of want to explain what I mean here, because it'll give us a bit more context, a bit more insight, and help us explain the relevancy of Reinach now today. So one of the first legacies of Reinach, and what makes him even more relevant to our contemporary situation, is that that there were a series of independent rediscoveries, right? So in 1955, J.L. Austin gave a series of lectures at Harvard, and they were published in 1962 under the title How to Do Things with Words. And Austin's central insight here was that some utterances don't just describe the world, they change it. When you say, I promise, you're not just reporting on a promise, you're making one. When you say, I apologize, you're not describing an apology, you're apologizing. So Austin called these performative utterances, and they launched an entire field of research called speech act theory. But now that we have this, now that I explained to you many of Reinach's insights, we can see that Reinach had developed a systematic theory of what he called social acts back in 1913, about 50 years earlier. And if you look at it, I would argue that Reinach's analysis was actually much more sophisticated than Austin's, because Austin struggled with the question of what makes performative utterances successful or unsuccessful. Reinach had already worked out the essential conditions, which were, if we remember, genuine intention, you have to have a proper addressee, and actual reception and understanding of what's going on. Now, Austin noticed that some speech acts require uptake from an audience, but Reinach had already identified the need of being heard as the defining characteristic of social acts. So Austin rediscovered by himself, let's say, part of Reinach's theory. Isn't this incredible? And so there's another example too. So take John Searle's groundbreaking 1969 book, Speech Acts. And Searle's famous for many other things, the Chinese room argument, but also for speech act theory, which he took from J.L. Austin rather than Reinach's social acts, because either he didn't know about them or whatever. We don't really know. But I think it's largely true that he developed it mainly in line with Austin, right? Whether or not he was aware of Reinach. But so Searle develops this distinction between what he calls brute facts and institutional facts in this 1969 book, Speech Acts. And brute facts are things like the stone is heavy, and institutional facts are things like this piece of paper is money, or Jones promised to pay Smith $5. Now, Searle argues that institutional facts depend on collective recognition and acceptance. But again, Reinach had already developed a more sophisticated analysis. In 1913, he had distinguished between what we might call natural facts and social facts. But unlike Searle, Reinach didn't think social facts depend on collective recognition. No, he thought that they have objective ontological status, which was grounded in the essential structures of social acts themselves. So when you make a promise, you create a real obligation, whether or not anyone else recognizes it as such. And then later on, we have Searle's 1995 book, The Construction of Social Reality, which try to explain how social institutions like money and marriage and governments can be objectively real even though they're human creations or institutions. And Searle's answer involved what he called collective intentionality, which is the shared acceptance of constitutive rules. But Reinach had pretty much already solved this problem 8 decades earlier. Social institutions are real because they're grounded in objective, essential structures. That was his theory. So marriage creates real obligations because promising creates real obligations. And marriage involves a kind of mutual promising. Money works because it's backed by a complex system of commitments and obligations. Government has authority because it's based on facts of authorization and recognition that create genuine normative facts. And so the difference is that Reinach didn't think these institutions were arbitrary human constructions. No, he thought that they were discoveries of objective possibilities built into the nature of social reality itself. So that was basically the first legacy, if you will. But now let's consider contemporary work in moral psychology. So, if you're not aware, in recent decades, philosophers and psychologists have become very interested in what's called the psychology of commitment. They try to answer questions like, how do promises bind us? What's the relationship between feeling obligated and being obligated? How do we understand the difference between genuine remorse and mere regret? But Reinach had already worked through many of these issues systematically in the beginning of the 20th century, because he distinguishes between the subjective sense of commitment and objective obligations. He showed how genuine remorse presupposes memory of past wrongdoing. He analyzed the phenomenology of obligation while maintaining that obligations themselves are objective facts. Contemporary philosophers like Michael Tomasello have written extensively about human beings' unique capacity for commitment and accountability. But Reinach had already provided the ontological foundations for understanding why commitment is possible and what makes it binding. And so the pattern is clear. Again and again, 20th century philosophy discovered insights, or rediscovered, let's say, insights that Reinach had already systematically developed. And in many cases, Reinach's analysis was more sophisticated than the later rediscoveries. And here's what makes things really interesting. We're still living with the consequences of these delayed rediscoveries. Contemporary debates about social media promises, digital contracts, online communities, virtual relationships even. All of these things involve questions that Reinach's framework could illuminate. Just think about it, right? So when you like someone's post on social media, are you making a kind of social commitment? When you accept their friend request, are you creating genuine social obligations? When you make plans through text messages, do you have some kind of obligations as when you make promises face to face? Reinach's analysis suggests these depend on whether digital interactions satisfy the essential conditions of social acts: genuine intentions, proper reception, mutual recognition that grounds social obligations. Right? We could even consider the contemporary debate about ghosting, where you suddenly cut off all communication with someone you've been talking to online, or you matched with on a dating app or something like this. If you try to make plans to meet up and they suddenly ghost you and don't talk to you again, why does this feel like a moral wrong? There's no, explicit promises made using words, right? But it's through messages. Okay, well, what's going on here? Well, Reinach's framework suggests that it's because making this promise through a text message involves implicit social acts that create legitimate expectations and corresponding obligations. Or think about the phenomena of cancel culture. It could even help here too, right? How? Well, when somebody makes a public statement that's widely criticized, what kind of social reality are we dealing with here? Are public statements social acts that create genuine obligations? Do they generate legitimate claims on the speaker's attention and response? Or how do we understand the normative structure of public discourse? I think here even Reinach's distinction between social and moral normativity is crucial. The fact that someone has said something publicly might create social obligations to respond or clarify. But whether these social obligations align with moral duties depends on the values at stake and their hierarchical ordering. And so again, probably Reinach, in conjunction with Max Scheler, is going to be crucial going forward in answering and illuminating some of these problems and answers to some of these questions. And so, but why is Reinach's methodological approach, why is it still relevant? Well, that's, I think, the third legacy. And so instead of trying to resolve these contemporary debates through abstract theorizing or empirical research alone, we can use a realist phenomenological analysis. We can pay careful attention to how these digital interactions actually present themselves in experience. We can trust our intuitive sense of what obligations are created and when they're not. And this doesn't mean anything goes, right? Remember, Reinach thought that there are essential structures, and these structures are objective. But it does it does mean that, we can discover that these structures, we can discover them through careful attention to experience rather than through some elaborate theoretical construction. And so the methodological legacy is just as important as the specific insights, because we can use these specific insights, we can use this methodology to help us answer the questions of when it comes to digitizing a lot of these speech acts, these social acts that Reinach and others throughout the 20th century were concerned with. Reinach showed us how to study social phenomena without reducing them to something else. We don't have to explain promising in terms of evolutionary psychology or economic incentives or social conditioning and convention. Rather, we can study promising as the phenomena actually exists as we make promises. And you can see how this is particularly relevant in our current intellectual climate, where there's a tendency to reduce everything to biology or to economics or to power relations or to social construction or to material conditions or to physical particles. Reinach's realist phenomenology, backed by his ontological structure of objects and states of affairs, and we can play with the ontological structure a bit, but the methodology offers an alternative. We take the phenomena seriously as they present themselves to us. We trust essential structures revealed in careful attention, and we don't assume that explanation requires reduction or bracketing. So this is the alternative, and there's perhaps a more poignant aspect of Reinach's legacy, and it's the counterfactual question. What if he had lived? How might 20th century philosophy have developed differently? How might the debates that we're having today been different? And so I think about this in terms of considering the split between what's called analytic and continental philosophy. And this sort of split has largely dominated 20th century philosophy. So roughly, analytic philosophers focus on language and logic and systematic analysis, basically, while continental philosophers emphasize experience, interpretation, and historical consciousness. But Reinach's approach kind of combined the best of both traditions. His systematic rigor with phenomenological sensitivity, careful analysis with attention to lived experience. And if Reinach had lived to develop his insights further and to evangelize, basically, we might have had a very different philosophical landscape. We might have had a phenomenology that stayed closer to ordinary experience instead of retreating into transcendental consciousness. We might have had an analytic tradition that took social reality seriously instead of trying to reduce it to logic and language. Now, it is starting to take it seriously if you look at social ontology or even social philosophy. But it's not as large enough of a research project yet as it might have been. We could have had the ball rolling 100 years ago instead of 20 or 30 years ago. So what might we have avoided in that interim, in some of the sterile debates that categorized the mid-20th century philosophy that still reverberate throughout academic journals and conferences and all these things? What might have been avoided? Or even consider the relationship between philosophy and other disciplines, right? So Reinach's background, he was a lawyer first. And this background in law gave him insights into social institutions that purely academic philosophers missed. And his realist phenomenology offered a way of studying social phenomena that could complement empirical research without being reduced to it. And so if his approach had been developed further by him, who, for all intents and purposes, like we've discussed, was a philosophical genius, if his approach had been developed further by him, if he had more time, we might have had much more productive relationships between philosophy and sociology, psychology, political science, law, you name it. Instead of seeing these as maybe competing approaches to social reality, or bracketing the internal world to focus only on the empirical science, or bracketing the external world to focus only on the internal part of it, we might have understood them as different ways of studying the same essential structures. But other things happen as well, where this focus on essences became kind of taboo and seen as not really rigorous and not to be taken seriously. And we're still living through that to this day, right now. And so, who knows what could have happened? And even more fundamentally, we could say, Reinach's approach offers resources for navigating moral and social complexities of contemporary life, like I kind of was trying to make the case of his legacies, using his analysis of the relationship between social and moral normativity to inform us about our pluralistic society, where people have different values but still need to interact cooperatively, constructively. And because we live in a world where we're constantly making and receiving commitments, we're creating and responding to obligations, we're participating in social institutions, and Reinach's insights can help us understand what we're doing when we engage in those activities, and help us achieve more insights on when we do that in both in the quote-unquote real world, let's say, or face-to-face, and also digitally, right? And so it can help us see why these social arrangements, whether digitally or in person, work and others don't work. And we can get more clearly about our obligations to each other and the institutions that we participate in. And probably most importantly, Reinach's realist phenomenology could help us trust our own experience of social reality. When you feel genuinely obligated by a promise you've made, you're not just having a psychological reaction, you're responding to an objective feature of social reality. When you feel wronged by someone who breaks a commitment to you, you're not just expressing a personal preference, you're recognizing a genuine normative fact. And this doesn't mean that all our institutions about social obligations are correct. No, it does mean that we can, but it does mean that we can have, and that we could trust careful attention to experience as a way of discovering the normative structure of social reality. And that perhaps is Reinach's most important legacy, the confidence that reality has structure, that when we can discover this structure through careful attention, and that understanding that structure can help us live more thoughtfully and cooperatively with each other. And that brings us to the end. So, what have we learned from Reinach? What can we still learn from him? And what is his brief but brilliant career? What has it taught us about philosophy, about social reality, about how we should live with one another? And I'd like to suggest in closing 3 lessons that I think are crucial for anyone trying to understand the human condition in the 21st century. And the first is that Reinach didn't discover promising's nature through elaborate theories or complex procedures. In fact, he discovered it by paying careful attention to what actually happens when we make promises. And it sounds simple, but it's actually very radical and very important, because we're trained to think common sense opposes sophisticated understanding. But Reinach successfully shows us that the obvious can be profound, that the ordinary experience reveals essential structures eluding theoretical analysis. And the challenge this poses is a bit uncomfortable, because we think, are we missing obvious features of reality because we're too committed to our theoretical frameworks? Are we failing to see what's right in front of us because we've been taught to look elsewhere? Think about how much intellectual energy has been spent trying to explain away social obligations or reduce them to something else. What if they don't need to be explained away? What if they are genuine features of reality that we can study directly? And Reinach's Phenomenology, his Realist Phenomenology, suggests that we can trust our experience of social reality while still being intellectually rigorous about it. When you feel genuinely bound by a promise you've made, you're not being naive or unscientific. You're recognizing, you're feeling an objective feature of the situation you're in. Second is the personal lesson. Every interaction you have with other people involves you in objective structures of social reality. This isn't just about abstract philosophical theory, it's about how we actually live in the world. So next time you make a promise, remember, you're not just expressing an intention or sharing information about your psychological state. In fact, you're creating a genuine obligation that has real ontological weight. The person you're promising has a legitimate claim on your behavior that didn't exist before you spoke. And the next time you make a request, or someone makes a request of you, or you make a request to someone, recognize that you're not just communicating a desire. You're creating a social situation that involves you in a network of legitimate expectations and corresponding obligations. And we need to take this seriously. This doesn't mean you should be paralyzed by the weight of social obligation. Because if you remember Reinach's distinction between social and moral normativity, social obligations can be overridden by higher moral duties, higher values that ground these moral duties. But they don't just disappear when they're overridden. They remain as genuine features of social reality that we need to acknowledge and navigate thoughtfully. And third, there's an intellectual lesson. We should be humble about what we might be missing, right? Because Reinach's insights lay dormant for decades. Not because they were wrong, but because the philosophical community wasn't ready to see them, or they didn't listen to some of his students, what they were writing. But I think it kind of does boil down to they just weren't ready to see them, or they didn't pay enough attention, or something like this. Because I think this is particularly relevant in our current intellectual climate, where we're often pressured to choose sides in false dichotomies, and we kind of do that very quickly. And I think Reinach's work, we can find a lesson here that it suggests that these dichotomies might be too crude. We might be too quick to jump in one camp or the other. Social institutions can be both objective and human created if they're grounded in essential structures that humans can discover and instantiate. Moral obligations can be both real and responsive to human values if values themselves have an objective hierarchical structure. And so philosophy can be both systematic and experiential if we trust phenomena to reveal their own essential structure. And perhaps this is a very important lesson in intellectual courage, because Reinach was willing to challenge his teacher directly, and his teacher's approach when his investigations led him in different direction. He trusted his philosophical insights even when they contradicted the methodological orthodoxy of his time. And this kind of intellectual courage is rare. It's particularly needed today, I would say, because we live in an era of increasing specialization and methodological dogmatism and technological echo chambers. So it's easy to get trapped in disciplinary silos, or to assume that there's only one legitimate way to approach certain philosophical questions. But Reinach's example suggests that we should be more experimental, more willing to follow phenomena wherever they lead, more trusting of insights that emerge from careful attention to experience, and we should be less worried about methodological purity, let's say, and more concerned with understanding reality as it actually presents itself. Now, I don't want to romanticize Reinach or suggest that his approach was perfect, right? He was simply working within the limitations of his time and his training. Some of his specific claims might need revision in light of subsequent developments, and I haven't really gone into those in this video because that's not the point of the video. The point is that his analysis of promising is very important. it might need to be supplemented by insights from psychology, sociology, or other empirical disciplines. But the fundamental approach, that's what's important. But the fundamental approach of taking social phenomena seriously as phenomena in their own right, by trusting essential characteristics revealed in careful attention, by maintaining both systematic rigor and a phenomenological sensitivity, that approach remains valuable. That approach remains critical to what we need in our current moment. Because here's what I think is probably the deepest lesson of Reinach's work, that reality is more interesting and more structured than most of our theories suggest. The social world we inhabit is not just a collection of arbitrary conventions or useful fictions. It's a domain of genuine phenomena with their own essential logic, their own objective structures, their own intrinsic interest. Understanding those structures can help us live more thoughtfully. It can help us to see why some relationships work and others don't, why some are successful and others aren't. It can help us understand our obligations, our promises, our commitments to each other, and to the institutions we participate in with better clarity and better expectations. It can help us to navigate the complex moral landscape of contemporary life more smoothly. You don't need special training or elaborate equipment or fancy methodological maneuvering. You need what Reinach called careful attention to experience. And so here's my final challenge to anybody watching this. Think about what other aspects of human experience we may be overlooking because we haven't learned to see them properly. What obvious features of reality are we missing because our theoretical frameworks don't have room for them? And these aren't just academic questions. They're questions about how we understand ourselves, about how we relate to one another, and how we can live more wisely in a complex social world. Now, in closing, to sum up, Adolf Reinach's early death reminds us how fragile philosophical progress can be. Brilliant insights can be lost for decades, sometimes centuries, sometimes millennia. Important discoveries can be forgotten. Entire research programs can disappear when their creators die or are silenced or are suppressed. But his rediscovered insights also show something hopeful, right? Because the truth has a way of making itself known. Even if it's 50, 100, 1,000 years, reality has a structure. And that structure can be discovered objectively by anyone willing to look carefully enough. That young philosopher who died in the trenches of Flanders in 1917 couldn't have imagined that his insights would be relevant to questions about social media, digital contracts, online communities. He'd have no idea about what these even meant. But the essential structures are universal and timeless. Once discovered, they remain available to anyone willing to see them. And I think that's Adolf Reinach's legacy. It's not just a set of philosophical insights, which by all means were very important, but it's about approaching reality with trust, with rigor, with careful attention. In a world that often seems chaotic and meaningless, he reminds us that there is a structure to be found, wisdom can be gained, and truth can be discovered. We just have to be willing to look. So, thank you very much for watching this video. Please, if you enjoyed it, leave a comment, subscribe to my channel. I'll be doing more videos like this about philosophers I like, cool themes in history and stories in history that I enjoy, and just a smattering of things that interest me. So stay tuned for the next video. I'll see you later.